collection at the Tate Britain, so you can go and see them at any time. We left off here yesterday, and I was talking about the connection of Burne-Jones's travels into Italy. He went 4 times in his lifetime, and they really were very significant in forming a classical ideology, but with which he married that to his own imagination. And we see a sort of reinterpretation here of A Birth of Venus, A Mirror of Venus, where he tries to encapsulate the Botticellian slender, refined beauty, but with his own otherworldly, ethereal take on imagery, and how he describes the pictures to himself, or what he's trying to achieve with his pictures, which is to create a dream world. And in fact, Rossetti often referred to the lifestyle that they all lived together in sort of dreamland, if you like. So let's move on and look at some other paintings of this early 70s, 1870s and 1880s period. It's the period of the Grosvenor Gallery, the very wealthy, very elitist exhibition space where Burne-Jones really came into his own when he was invited to exhibit there at the opening, which was in 1877. And this painting he produced started in about 1873, but only actually exhibited a lot later. It's called Laus Veneris, which means in praise of the Venus, or the praise of Venus. And as we mentioned yesterday, when you first see a Burne-Jones picture, if you like colour and pattern and decoration and romanticism, you'll be immediately drawn into it, and you'll stand there and think, oh, this is just so lovely. And you may walk away and think that that's all it was. But as I said to you yesterday, that I'd like to invite you to look in, because there is always this rather sinister undertone into a lot of his works, especially the mythological themed ones, where you have as a protagonist Venus, the goddess of love. What could be more romantic than that? But with Venus comes, with love, of course, comes also pain. And very often, and especially when we know a little bit about Burne-Jones's private life and his very tumultuous affair with the beautiful Maria Zambacco, you know that this idea of love and pain was part of his DNA and part of his psyche. And certainly when he's exhibiting a painting with the theme of love, you're always going to get this undertone of sinisterness around it. One of the circle, if you like, of the second generation Pre-Raphaelites was a poet known as Algernon Swinburne. He was a redhead, he had a shock of bright red, orangey hair, and he was a charismatic, eccentric person, and very much a part of their circle. And he wrote a poem of the same title as this. And he describes it, for example, her little chambers drip with flower-like red. Well, already for me, it's a vision that is conjured up of quite an unquiet place. Blood dripping or red dripping or something dripping is a sort of uneasy feeling. And there's something rather suffocating and dense about this painting. And when you look closely at it, it reveals Venus as a sort of person of entrapment. With her beauty, she lures her suitors in. And you get that sense here where she looks cold. She doesn't look a sensual, warm-blooded, real-life woman that you feel you could engage in some level. She looks to me as if you were to touch that rather lovely, slender neck, it would feel cold. And although she's draped in this exquisite gown, we'll look at the detail of that in a second, the colours are very rich, very sensual, very warm, yet at the same time there is this coldness and almost a sort of ethereal atmosphere to it as well. And it's a dangerous beauty. So beware, I suppose, is what he might be warning people with an image like this, is that when you're drawn into the beauty of somebody, you know that along with that there is the potential for, if there's great love and great passion, there's also the potential for great pain and great despair as well. And I think it's a theme that certainly followed Burne-Jones since his affair with Maria Zambacco. He never really got over her, and he had these constant bouts of anxiety and trauma to do with that particular relationship. And we see repeated again and again the very lovely features of her. You can see in this quartet of ladies in waiting here that they all very much feature the profile of Maria Zambaco. So it's another painting as well that appeals to the senses, and in the sense that you look at it, you're looking at it with your eyes, you want to touch it. We'll look at some close-ups of it now because the textures are so vivid and so appealing. You've got a peacock fan here, so in your head you know that the feathers are going to be very tactile. You've got the rose on the floor here. The rose, of course, is the symbol of love. A red rose is the symbol of passionate love. But the smell of the rose, so it's appealing to the smell as well. You've got a beautiful little musical instrument here of chiming bells, and so you're going to be hearing this picture as well. So it's a sensual painting in terms of the fact that it appeals to the senses, and that was very much in line with the aesthetic movement. There is a narrative to this. There's a story. It's from the Tannhauser legend that was revisited in the poem by Algernon Swinburne. But more than telling the story, it's actually arousing an emotion and arousing a sensual response from the viewer's point of view. Let's just look at a couple of details. We know that Burne-Jones spent a lot of his life involved in the design of tapestry work. He was fascinated with being able to reproduce oil paintings and watercolours in a different medium as well. He's very well known for that. And tapestry has been part of the decorative arts of England for a very long time. This tapestry here, although it looks like it might come out of the Victorian arts and crafts movement, is actually known as the Sheldon tapestry. It was made roughly around 1580 in Britain in a tapestry workshop near Worcester to rival the great tapestry houses of Belgium and France at the time. And if you're interested in seeing it, if you're in England, it's actually housed in Sudeley Castle. It's one of their great treasures. But it comes with the same arts and crafts feel to it that was picked up later in these designs by William Morris and Morris & Co., and specifically Edward Burne-Jones. But in his paintings, he gave them almost a tapestry-like quality. There's no spaces, everything's dense. If we go back to the original picture, there's a very, very shallow picture frame here. We only get this tiny little bit of perspective at the back here with these poor 5 cold knights in shining armour at the back here. They look a little bit hesitant, actually, as to whether they should enter the chamber of this very revered goddess of love or not. They look a little bit uncertain, if you ask me. But this portion of the painting is very much the idea of tapestries. We see this is Venus here, this is Cupid, the arrow. There's the arrow moment when the poor unsuspecting person is going to be stabbed, and from that point on the pain and the joy of love will be theirs. They're offering up hearts, so it's a very sort of symbolic, allegorical feature of the painting to offer this sort of worship towards Venus. And then we see there's a texture here. When you look closely at this painting, you can see it's not just painted smoothly. It's painted and then a tiny pattern detail has been added on top of that, almost as if it is an embroidered work or a tapestry work. And we see the delicate little bell instrument here. You can almost sound a little bit like the bells of a temple in the Far East, that very delicate, tiny little tinkling sound, but at the same time it is going to draw you in because it's appealing to your sense of hearing. And then to your sense of touch, you have this beautiful peacock fan, and a peacock being a symbol of immortality. And one thing I'd like to point out to you at this stage is that this fan features in many other paintings. You see it here in a different colorway, we see it here, and this is the original. And the reason for this, I think anyway, is that all of these artists of the time, they knew each other. There was a very strong circle of artists that congregated around some of the great studios, mostly in the sort of southwest of England, of London, for example, where Burne-Jones lived, which was in Fulham. Lord Leighton lived in Notting Hill. And these great studio houses were like salons, if you like. People spent time there just listening to the artist, being very much part of the artist's life. And I think they swapped props between each other, because that's the only way you could explain how this same fan, and it is, I think, exactly the same fan, probably got passed around. I think it might have belonged to Rossetti. He was fascinated with peacocks. In fact, where he lived in Cheyne Walk, number 16 Cheyne Walk, it's a beautiful property now owned by the Sainsbury family. It has a big garden at the back. And he kept peacocks in the garden. Well, if you know the sound of peacocks, you'll know it sounds like a crying child, or a cry for help, in fact. And apparently in the deeds of the house, it is written that no peacocks allowed to any subsequent owners of the property. Such was the problem caused. But it's also that connection to the symbolic meaning of peacocks, the immortality and immortality of the soul, that this group of artists were very much keen on. And just to give you an idea, this is the property where Burne-Jones lived. It's called the Grange, North End, or the end of what is now the North End Road in Fulham, which, as you can see, was very rural, although this is probably later than when he lived there. It's about the turn of the century. But he had two big studios attached to this property, one inside and then what's known as the garden studio, where he would spend many days, weeks and months working on more than one project at a time. He never did a painting, finished it, moved on to the next one. He had very often upwards of 20 paintings that he would be working on at any one time, which also explains why so many of those were unfinished when he sadly died. But remember, a running theme of his was this fear of what the Industrial Revolution, the fact that the little village of Fulham, where he was living at the time, by the time he died, the trains had already arrived there, and he was going to, and along with the trains, of course, come the properties prospectors. This photograph was taken in the 1950s, and then this is all that is left of the garden. The house was demolished after, about 50 years after he died, the house was demolished. And this is how it looks now, just this little patch here, which, according to the earth, was actually once part of the garden. So it's sort of, I just wanted you to understand that these artists didn't work independently of each other. They were very much a group. Ideologically, they were very connected. They spoke a lot. They shared themes. They shared, as we saw the other day, yesterday with Rossetti, Burne-Jones makes a painting, Rossetti responds with such enthusiasm that he writes a sonnet about it. And then equally, for example, the work of William Morris, The Earthly Paradise, served as a theme for many ideas of paintings for Burne-Jones. So there was this reciprocal life that they lived. They shared studio space. This is Burne-Jones' studio space. This is the painting that's on the easel. It's actually this one here that he finished, of a peacock, very much part of their interest, symbolic interest. And he had a ladder specifically made so that he could get to the top. As I said to you, after his visits to Italy and his interest with Michelangelo, he went big. He loved to work on a big, grandiose, monumental scale. Other works that he was producing at this time, this is one of the top 3 most popular paintings in the Tate Britain. It was donated to the Tate, so it is on permanent display. And it's one that you stand in front of and you gaze at it and you think, what is it all about? When I was a young girl, we used to live near the Tate Britain, and my father used to take us there on a Saturday morning. So these images for me are like visiting old friends. And I've always thought this was perhaps to do with the 12 Dancing Princesses, a story that my sister and I loved as young children. But there's 18 of these princesses, and they're barefoot. So it doesn't really go with that fairy story. It's lyrical, it's harmonious. The colour palette is very reduced. It's really the shades of gold and silver, and the deepening golds and the deepening silvers, and green of the greenery and around their arms. It's delicate, it's refined, it's got a Botticellian refinement to it. You can see very specifically in the drapery. It's fine, almost crispy drapery, because it's actually a fabric that's in fashion at the moment, this heat treated to crinkle. And it's as if it's that very modern fabric. Each one holds a musical instrument, but nobody's playing a musical instrument. And this is quite an important thing about Burne-Jones, is that he often depicts the moment in anticipation before the thing or the rest of the story actually takes place. And there's a lot of drama in that anticipation. There's a lot of excitement, and it is a pictorial device that was used also way back into the early Italian painters by Giotto in the Scrovegni Chapel. He very often depicted the moment just before, for example, the kiss of Judas. It's not after the kiss when all the chaos takes place. It's that moment just before the betrayal takes place, where anticipation is at its highest. And we have that sort of idea here. These girls are perhaps they're descending into a music room, into a concert hall, into a private space of their own. Or are they leaving somewhere because those lights just go off, yeah. They're leaving somewhere that they've just finished playing. So now they're a little bit tired and they're walking down maybe to their bedchambers, which are down here. Whichever way it is, what Burne-Jones does is leave you to decide the destiny. And it's a theme that occurs in so many of his works. He doesn't give you the whole story. He leaves you to think, is it a before or an after event picture? Is this the before party or is this the after party? And he wants you to arouse your imagination to work out what the destiny of these young ladies is. And as with the discussion yesterday, if you know this is in the Camera degli Sposi in Mantua. It's a whole ceiling that's frescoed by Mantegna. And to me, there's the little opening at the back here, the blue of the sky, the birds on the edge. We've got an idea that he would have picked up on, having seen this in his previous Italian travels. We see these ideas everywhere creeping into him, these allusions and these references to the Italian Renaissance, and I think that is a very specific one. So another picture where we are left confused, but not confused in an unhappy way, confused in a calm, harmonious way, just wondering, thinking, using our own imagination to finish off the story here. He produced not only narrative pictures, as I've mentioned, he began to reduce his works into very much a symbol of something. These are the symbols of night and the symbol of the evening star. These really were the precursors for the symbolist movement that didn't find great success in the rather more austere art world of the British community or the British culture at the time. It moved into Europe very quickly, into Paris and into Germany and into Belgium, where life was a little bit more liberal for artists, where they began to paint art for art's sake. There's nothing educational about these pictures, there's nothing historical about them. They are purely the artist painting something beautiful, art for art's sake. It was a mantra, if you like, of these late aesthetic movement followers. And again, it's a limited colour palette. It's blue, and the shades of blues and greens and yellows. So you've got just your two primary colours moving between each other, especially in this one here. But again, you've got these features that we've seen before, these familiar features of Maria Zambacco that never really leave him. Whatever choice of subject matter he's depicting, it appears to be a self-same image. And that is a line that also refers to a poem written by Cristina Rossetti for her brother Dante Gabriel Rossetti, when he also repeated endlessly the face of Elizabeth Siddal. They both had these muses which became an obsession for them. They couldn't get the features out of their mind, and they repeat them again and again, and we've got an example of that here. One of the paintings which gave Burne-Jones international stature was this one, because it was exhibited, after it was exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery, it then went across into Europe, and it was exhibited in Paris in 1878, I think, at the Exposé Universelle, which really gave it a global audience. And it really sort of cemented him, as many believed him to be, as the most talented painter of this later part of the century. It's called Kinky and the Beggar Maid. We've got the lovely figure of the king here. Unusually, of course, because he's in a lower subordinate composition to this slender, rather austere beggar maid, dressed very simply in this grey, almost sort of diaphanous see-through gown, but looking at her in an adoring manner, looking up at her. And the light of the painting falls onto her. He's darker, more shadowy. The light of the picture falls on her. And you've got an outside light at the back here. You can see in this window here. But somehow there's a sort of downward spiral, and there's a staircase that comes down, and a sort of shadowy entrance here. Again, leaving you to think, what's the next scene? You know, if this was a cartoon, and this is one little picture frame, what is the next scene going to be? Is he going up the staircase and taking her out into the daylight and into the light, or is she going to be taking him down into this rather gloomy recess at the bottom here? Again, it's another example of Burne-Jones leaving us in suspense, anticipating what might happen next, rather than actually telling us the whole story. But of course, this was a topical story at the time for the socialist movement, very much of which William Morris was a part of how love and beauty could transcend power and wealth. And the king, of course, represents the power and the wealth, but the beggar maid and her beauty is something far more important, and he is prepared to give up his kingship for the love and the beauty of the person in front of him. We see that there are some anemones. She's holding anemones here, and there are a few scattered around. Again, in the language of flowers, an anemone was a sign of sorrow and grief. It was believed that Aphrodite, when faced with the death of Adonis, her lover, her tears, as they fell to the ground, fell into the petals of red anemones. So from classical mythology point of view, it's symbolic of grief to do with a lost love, but also that has been transposed into Christian mythology, and so it is a symbol of the passion of Christ and the grief concerned with the passion of Christ. And it's interesting to point out that Burne-Jones' own spiritual ideology was connected to a group known as the Tractarians. He was brought up as an Anglican, but he admired and enjoyed, if you like, the rituals of the Catholic Church, the High Catholic Church, the incense, the robes, the imagery, all associated with Catholic rituals. And the Tractarians sought to combine those two and created, another name would also be High Anglicanism. And he's always, we'll see again in the final picture today, that he very successfully sometimes blends the Greek mythology and Christian theology into sometimes being one and the same characters, or in this case he'll do it more subtly, and the presence of the red anemones, the fallen red anemones, which refer to the blood spilt during the Passion of Christ, but they also refer to the tears spilt for Aphrodite, or the Venus, the goddess of love, at the death of her lover. So it's nice to look out for these little symbols. A nice thing to point out here in the figure of the king is that, yes, he is dressed in a suit of armour, but it's not a sort of hard, angular, metallic suit of armour. It looks almost sort of feathery, and I hope you can see this quite clearly, but the epaulets, for example, they don't look that they're rigid and hard. They look perhaps more if they're made of leather rather than if they're made of metal. And somehow it gives a softness. The pose, the seating of him, there's something very human about him. And I think perhaps another autobiographical image in a way, where you've got the Burne-Jones who sees himself in the position of the king, overtaken with the beauty and the love of Maria, who again is the features of the beggar maid here. And there's just a sort of softness to the pose that he's sitting in. He's relaxed, just gazing up at her, But what's interesting again is that she looks outward. There's no emotional connection between the two here. He's looking at her, but she's looking out at us in a rather sort of distracted way, which very often accompanies a beautiful person. If you look, for example, if you ever watch a catwalk, one of the great fashion houses catwalks, you see these beautiful women acknowledged globally as great beauties of our time, and yet they walk in a distracted way. They look almost cold and inhuman. They're so concerned with what they represent more than any emotional connection to that. It's a distracted look that the catwalk models have, and I think it's the same sort of distracted look that she has as well. Remember, she's sitting and the artist is painting her at the time. If you try to picture this little scenario taking place inside a studio, you can't engage eye contact all the time with the person who's painting you. You have to look into a middle distance. The same way that I'm sure if you're walking along a catwalk in high stilettos, you need to have an eye point so that you don't actually topple over. You can't engage with somebody in particular. And this rather distracted look of beauty is something that is referenced very often in the late pre-Raphaelite work. I've put at the bottom, this was the last picture exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery before its decline. Rather sadly for Coutts Lindsay, in 1882, his lovely wife, who was the sort of really the protagonist, if you like, of the Grosvenor Gallery and got everything happening, she left him after 5 years of putting up with his philandering, and eventually left him. He was not able, after her leaving, to keep it going for too long. He tried to involve the gallery in commercial ventures, but artists like Burne-Jones were appalled at this, having opened with great acclaim to this sort of sale room, if you like. Now that that ideology has changed, Burne-Jones decided to leave, and this was the last painting that he ever exhibited there. He went on to exhibit at a place rather uninspiringly called the New Gallery, a few doors down, which was opened by rivals of the Lindsay family. And we see how, in a way, although the Royal Academy were not accepting of his paintings, he didn't give in, if you like, to an idea that was expected of him. He stuck to his own imagination. And again, we see a revisiting of the stories of Arthur, the Morte d'Arthur. We see here it's Lancelot in the dream of the Grail, the angel standing outside the chapel where the Holy Grail is housed. He's not allowed to enter because he's committed sin with the wife of Arthur. So again, it's these complicated love trysts of historical tales that very much play out in the imagination of Burne-Jones. But what a hard picture this is compared to the softness and the colourfulness of some of his other pictures. It's a really reduced, dark palette. There's greys, browns, blacks, the shadow of light falling on here, but it's very sinister. It's very uncomfortable to look at, but that didn't worry him because it's something he wanted to produce. There's almost a sort of angularity here. It's as if these folds are made of a very stiff, unforgiving fabric. But what interested me was the horse here, this horse in foreshortened at the back. I knew I'd seen that in a previous picture, and I think it's this. I've seen it here, which if you're familiar with the legend of the True Cross, this is a scene of the Queen of Sheba, and to the left of that image is this very famously foreshortened horse by Piero della Francesca, where all you really get to see the horse in its side reverse profile. And I think that there's a lovely direct link there with what he would have seen when visiting Assisi. He was, as I put at the bottom here, he was uncompromising in his own personal quest and personal imagination. He didn't give in to an expected formula that he might have had he offered pictures up to the Royal Academy. He kept very much away from that environment. We're going to look now, finally, at two cycles of paintings. What he loved about visiting Italy were these great fresco cycles, especially, for example, Giotto in the Scrovegni Chapel, 36 panels of telling stories. And he began to produce pictures telling a story, but in multiple scenes, designed specifically for a specific place. And this one was a commission offered to him by, at the time it was Alexander Henderson, who was Lord Farringdon. There is still a Lord Farringdon that lives at Buscott Park in Wiltshire. It's a marvellous stately home owned now by the National Trust. And you can go and visit, and you walk into this beautiful drawing room, and there you are faced with the 4 panels of The Story of the Briar Rose, or The Sleeping Beauty by Edward Burne-Jones. And the idea was also taken from the idea of the Grosvenor Gallery, is that your home space could also become a private gallery space. So you could use the entire wall of a single room exhibiting works of art, but not individual works of art, exhibiting a story into one room. And it was very successful, this particular story. It started off as being 4 panels telling the story of the Sleeping Beauty, but when it was put in, because Buscott Park is very conveniently situated near to a place called Kelmscott in Lechlade, where, very fortunately for Burne-Jones, his great friend Dante Rossetti had taken residence there with William Morris and Jane Morris. William Morris rather foolishly left for a long 6-month trip to Iceland. He was very taken with the Nordic countries and left his best friend Dante Gabriele Rossetti to look after his lovely wife Jane Morris. And of course, that's a whole other story for another time as to what happened there. Never leave your wife in the trust of your best friend if he's Italian, or even half Italian. So when Burne-Jones saw the 4 panels installed, he realised that they didn't actually fit the room well enough. There were gaps in between. So in situ, he painted these fill-in places here. There's 10 of them, apparently. And so the whole thing is now a complete. Most of the panels are just the briars, which is the connecting line all the way through the event. But it really was the first example of his work actually being a visual completeness, if you like. Even the gaps in between are done by him. In this exhibition, they have this entire work on loan at the Tate at the moment, which has been recreated into one of the exhibition rooms, and it looks marvellous. The Sleeping Beauty was a story that Burne-Jones loved. He probably would have been familiar with it as a child. He would have known the version of the Brothers Grimm, and it's something that stayed with him. In 1864, he designed this tile piece, which was executed by the Morris & Co. company. And of the 9 panels here, the only one that is replicated in the Buscott version is this central panel here, where we've got the knight and the sleeping soldiers here. So let's have a look at that. Here we've got the Buscott painting. The knight acts almost, to me, it looks like, you know, on a manuscript where you have the elaborate first letter of the capital letter of the first word is enlarged and decorative. It's almost as if the knight is the first point, if you like, of the story. He is the first capital letter of the story. He is the only, out of 24 figures in the 4 paintings, he is the only one who's actually awake or depicted as being awake, and he's the only one standing up. So his sort of vertical stance draws your eye in. And it goes, obviously, you read the pictures and you read the cycle from left to right as you would read the story in a book. And here are the sleeping soldiers. Here we have echoes of this from, for example, The Resurrection by Piero della Francesca, the sleeping soldiers around the tombstone, very much following on from that idea. And this these were the soldiers who have been unsuccessful in getting to the Sleeping Beauty. We can see that their shields and their weapons are caught up in the briars. Remember from yesterday that the briar rose is the symbolic plant of pain and love. You've got the pain of the thorns, and you've got the beauty, pain and beauty, or pain and love. You've got the rose, which is a symbol of beauty, but you've also got the rose as a symbol of love. And yet the thorns are going to cause you a great deal of pain on your way to attaining the rose at the end of it. And these thorns are very dense, very thick, and impenetrable, as we can see here by these poor and suspecting soldiers here who haven't made it any further in. But we have, of course, the knight here, light shining onto his armour. This is going to be the successful one. The second chamber in the cycle, we have very significantly on the left here, on the right, sorry, is the hourglass. An hourglass is something that shows us the passing of time. And we look at an hourglass for boiling an egg. In olden times, they used to have them in churches where the priest's sermons would be timed by the turning of the timer. And it's a visual passing of time. We don't really notice time passing because it just passes, and it's only the clock or something that we know the time has gone. We don't actually notice it, except when you look at the passing of time in something like that. So this is a suspended animation. Time has stood still. Time isn't moving on here. These people have been in these positions for a very, very long time. But it's interesting to me how he manages to show them they're definitely sleeping and not dead. There's something about them which still looks to me as if they are living, and that in another dimension, time is moving on, but in their dimension, the time has been suspended. The reflection, Burne-Jones loved reflections. They all of these aesthetic movement group, they loved mirrors, they loved reflections, and what that could do to an image and to your imagination, because it slightly distorts the real image that you're looking at. The floor is so polished and shiny that they are very well reflected in it. But all the way through, you've got this running thread of the rather sinister and almost menacing briar. You can imagine this is almost like a sea serpent, the twines of it. It feels claustrophobic and dangerous. And there it is. Books closed, slumped here, but they are sleeping and they're not dead. Here we have this is very much the male domain here. As you can see, this is the council where the king is, the father of the sleeping beauty, the terrible day, of course, when the prophecy came true and she pricked her finger at the age of 16. This is the female vision, if you like, the female chapter. And again, to me, they're sleeping and not. This is somebody just nodding their head for 100 years, as opposed to have actually lost life. The loom, obviously, at the time, this is the Industrial Revolution. Looms were very much part of everyday life, and the association of noise and movement and industry and manufacturing. Somehow with this suspended loom, it's another example of time being suspended. It's a frozen moment. The loom has stopped. It must be very quiet and very still. And there's balls of wool and threads and everything here. Again, these horizontal curvings, we've seen this. We saw this in the watercolour of Circe when she was inclined almost to a horizontal form. So it's picking up again on the same type of composition. And again, this reflective atmosphere, but this menacing briar is really something that takes over everything until we come finally, and if you notice, we go back to the beginning, this is the darkest panel, and then there's a little more light here, there's more light here, and then all of a sudden there's this beautiful light. This is the one that's situated over the fireplace, and it really is, it's so impressive when you see it all together. But again, this is a dense, claustrophobic space. It's somewhere where, yes, you've got the dominant horizontal sleeping beauty, again, echoes of a painting by Mantegna, The Dead Christ by Mantegna, this very thin, slender, diaphanous robe. There's been some allusions, apparently, to possibly Burne-Jones's daughter, Margaret, being part of the ideology here. This was painted around the time that she was to be married, and he was very traumatized by her leaving home and leaving the family and moving into adulthood. He had very odd relationships with young girls, which today would be considered extremely extremely unfashionable and dangerous, and not the sort of thing that one would expect. And I'm talking about prepubescent girls as well as girls of sort of 12, 13. Remember, in the Victorian era, the age of consent was as young as 12. So these girls are not 18. They didn't have to be 18, but still there were some very unsavoury liaisons taking place, all within, of course, the very respectable ambit of the artist studio. And he was traumatised about his own girl, his own little girl, Margaret, moving into womanhood as she moved into marriage and leaving the family home. And this is possibly a reference to her. So we had the start, the vertical figure, and we've moved down and swept in a large horizontal cycle all the way round, arriving at the Briar Rose herself, the rose, the Sleeping Beauty. Very dense, very decorative, again in the manner of a tapestry. But we see at the back here, there's a little window of hope here, a little light peering at the back. This is the outside world that's got lighter and lighter. As we imagine, as we move into each scene, we can sort of imagine the night following on behind us. He has managed to get through. He got into the king's chamber. He got into the room where the girls were working on their loom. And he's now just behind us, entering into the Sleeping Beauty. But of course, typically Burne-Jones, he doesn't kiss. We don't see the kiss. It's anticipated. He's just behind us. He's just about to wake her up. She is just about to be roused out of her sleep. And it is in that anticipation that he leaves us hanging, if you like, and wanting, I think, to look again and see, is there more? Did I miss something here? Is she waking up? Or is that still going to happen? And it's perhaps in part answers why these images, not for all, but for some, and for me especially, they are enduring. They do require a second look. They require you to really look deeply into it, because it's not all done. We know the story of the Sleeping Beauty. The prince eventually finds her. She falls asleep for 100 years. He finds her. He gives her a kiss. She wakes up, and they all live happily ever after. That's the boring end. He doesn't want to leave you with that. He wants to leave you with, if you like, that pain of not knowing what's going to happen in the end, as perhaps in his own life was reflected like that. Because after Maria Zambacco, it's not documented that he had any other specific relationships, sexual relationships, but he definitely had significant female relationships with older and younger women. So it's leaving this open-ended that perhaps also echoes how his life was left as well. So that's the other thing is that this the briar, the story of the briar, comes as an allegory for the briar is this growing thing, this wealth, this capitalism that's happening around him, this fear of the Industrial Revolution, and fear of, more than anything, the consequences of society and ideology and imagination, with this overwhelming sense of impending doom. What does Ruskin call them? The storm clouds are gathering. The storm clouds of technology, the storm clouds of industry. Imagine, poor man, if he'd lived into the next century, what he would have witnessed. But it's love and it's beauty and it's imagination and it's desire that can ultimately win over all of those negative forces. And that was really what he truly held. He held that deeply within him, that these painterly outpourings of beauty, his quest, if you like, talking about his quest for his own immortality, was very much about his quest for love and for beauty. And that is exhibited here in the sense of it's strong, it's powerful. We stop at the end here with this vertical line here and her horizontal composition. That is the end of the quest, is love and its beauty. So by complete contrast, we'll just look quickly at another cycle. It's known as the Perseus Cycle. It was commissioned for another grand room, this time in a house in London. Arthur Balfour, who was later, of course, to become Prime Minister. And this was just a small watercolour drawing that Burne-Jones did of some of the panels and how they were going to be hung and how they were going to look. You can see here this lovely acanthus leaf wallpaper by Morris as a backdrop to these quite subdued panels telling the story of Perseus from the point where Perseus is asked to kill Medusa. He's given a task which pretty much meant for the person who set it for him that it was going to be his certain death, because nobody could get near to the Medusa, because if you looked at her, you would turn to stone. And so anybody who'd ever tried to kill the Gorgon Medusa had failed because she had turned them to stone. But of course, we have a hero here, and the story ends in a different fashion. But let's look at how Burne-Jones interprets this story. He again uses a very reduced colour palette. There are quite a number of versions of this story. Some are the unfinished works in watercolour, and there are only 4 panels which are actually finished in the final oil. It never got to Arthur Balfour's property. Sadly, Burne-Jones died before the commission was finished, and they are now more or less scattered in various collections, not only in England but around the country. This is one of the watercolour panels here. Again, you've got the lovely nod to Botticelli classicism, Renaissance drapery here, the reflection of the pool underneath, very much part of his ideology. This is Perseus being assisted by these goddesses here. He's given the helmet of invisibility. If only the younger generations knew that the cloak of invisibility, the idea of something of invisibility, was much older than any invention by J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter stories. He's given this helmet of invisibility so that he can creep up, allegedly, on the Gorgon Medusa and gives him a better chance. He's given the winged slippers of Hermes so that he can speedily work his way. The gods were on his side to help get rid of this terrible person. And this really lovely sort of blues, greys, browns, very reduced colour palette, but again, the self-same face that stares out at him. And a little later on in the story, the Grey Sisters, he comes across the Grey Sisters on his way to finding Medusa, but they are extraordinary in themselves in that they are described as being hideous and wailing and crone-like and ugly, and they share one tooth and one eye between them. And they talk and see, and they pass around this eye. As children, my children were terrified of the Grey Sisters when I used to read to them the Greek mythology stories, because just the thought of having to pull your one eye out and pass it on to your sister so she can see, and then if you want to talk, you have to share your one tooth as well. But the paradox, of course, of Burne-Jones is that he portrays them as these rather lovely, demure, classical maidens with refined features and elegant drapery. And there's none of that sort of menace or horror that's conjured up in the imagination of the original Greek story. It's very typical of him to add of a moment really which should be illustrating menace and fear. He's actually giving us, again, another version of his beauty. And again, he's about, you can just see in the pause here, the little tiny gap here, he's about to take the one eye. And of course they are left, all 3 of them are left blind once Perseus has taken the eye, but he needs the eye to be able to see his way to find Medusa. So it's that moment just before perhaps the wailing of the 3 Grey Sisters as they are then left blind without him. And again, it's in that anticipation that the dramatic effect of the painting is revealed. Eventually, when he finds Medusa, he is able to kill her because he has his helmet of invisibility, and he's also, I forgot to point out here, he's given this very special bag. It's a lined bag so that as he cuts her head off, he shoves the head into the bag, and the bag is impenetrable, so she can no longer, even because it was alleged that she would go on living even if you were to cut her head off. She would go on seeing, and so she still had the potential to turn you to stone. But in this special lined bag, that was going to be impossible. This is such a dramatic painting. It speaks to me almost of a time of Salvador Dali or Giorgio de Chirico, where you've got symbols of a story taking place. The reduction in narrative here is quite extraordinary when you think of the time frame that this was produced. 3 symbolic snakes falling out of her head here. As legend goes, as her head is cut off. And again, the Gorgon Medusa was revered as this terrifying being. And here she is sort of draped as if she's one of the Elgin marbles, in this lovely sort of delicate drapery. Out of her head allegedly comes the winged horse Pegasus, and another figure which may or may not be sometimes referred to as a wild boar, a winged boar, or a winged horse, I think it was. And then this is Chrysios here. And this particular reimagining, if you like, of the story, which comes from the Tales of the Earthly Paradise, that William Morris's version of Perseus, is just this very slender, idealized human form. So we've got action here, the drama's happened, the head's off, the snakes are pouring out, and in the next frame we see Perseus flying off into the distance with the head in the bag, glancing back at poor Atlas, who unfortunately, before the head was put into the bag, did look at the Gorgon Medusa. He was turned to stone, and it happened to be at the very moment where he was holding in his hand the cosmos, not the world, as sometimes we see a figure of Atlas holding up the world. He didn't hold up the world. He held up the cosmos. And the cosmos is here depicted as the signs of the zodiac, or the symbols of the zodiac. So sometimes when you see that, it's an error. But all against this rather sort of almost apocalyptic backdrop. None of the delicacy of the refined tapestry-like backdrop that we saw in the Briar Rose. This is a very different Burne-Jones working at this stage. The two... Eventually, when he takes the head of Medusa back, and he's then tasked with rescuing Andromeda, who he is in love with and who he wants to end up marrying. So I love the titles of these two, The Rock of Doom and The Doom Fulfilled. It's sort of immediately with the title you're drawn into the sense of something really significant happening here. And here he is, but we barely notice the male. We barely notice him because the light is all fallen on this rather lovely classical depiction of Andromeda, looking rather coy, I might add, as she glances away from him, as if to say, well, here I am, but you shouldn't really be looking. And there, of course, he is smitten with her loveliness, but the colour is so blended in to the rock and the turbulent water that it's actually only her that our eye falls on, beautifully juxtapositioned in the second frame as she's turned around very convincingly, glancing across at her hero Perseus as he wrestles with this enormous sea serpent, which of course was set to devour her. Here she is chained up here, and here she is being released by her hero. And I said to you yesterday, remember this, because we'll have a look at it tomorrow. And it was this. Remember I said to you about the nightmare of being trapped in a globe with a serpent, and how that rather slithery serpent, there's the creation of Adam and Eve in the days of the act of creation, the days of creation. And there is that sort of similar reimagining of that sea serpent again, but now on a vast, grand scale. These are big pictures. They're 2 meters tall. They're about 1.5 meters to 2 meters wide. They're big volume, they're impressive. You stand in front of them and you really feel involved in the encompassing it. Had the cycle come to fruition, it really would have been a marvellous thing to see. But it's interesting how the male is the action person. Everything that the man does is about movement and saving and dynamism. But the static one is the woman. But the way he's orientated the light, again here, of course, you do see the serpent and you do see him. It mirrors exactly the opposite of what's happening here. It's actually the light that falls on the beauty. What is his quest? What is Perseus's ultimate quest? It wasn't to kill Medusa. It was to marry Andromeda, the love of his life. So again, it's a repetition of the ultimate quest, if you like, which was for love and beauty. And we see that finally in this one, where he's linked arms with Andromeda, and there is the head, you see, with the snakes up here, but they can't. They're still fearful of looking at her, just in case there's a little element of magic left in her and she would turn them to stone. You see here is the bag. These are all the narrative elements that are telling the story.